The trial of ashes had never once failed to expose a liar. Sorrel Vane knew this better than anyone because she had spent 19 years building the lie she was about to lose. The circle of the Ashwood pack stood 3 rows deep around the scorched stone platform, torches guttering against the night wind, every eye fixed on the girl kneeling at its center. She had been wolfless since birth, or so the pack records claimed. So her mother had sworn, weeping, to the healers who came to check the newborn's eyes for the telltale gold ring that never appeared. So Sorrel herself had repeated, quietly, for 19 years, every time someone asked why she flinched from silver, why she never shifted at the solstice gatherings, why she smelled faintly, permanently, of wrongness. She had gotten very good at being nothing. "Kneel and place your palm on the stone," the trial warden said, and Sorrel did, because refusing was its own confession. The stone was old magic, older than the pack itself, carved by the first alphas to burn away every disguise a wolf could wear. It did not care about 19 years of careful lying. It did not care that she had learned to walk like a human, speak like a human, bleed like a human, on command, so no one would ever look twice. It only cared about what was true. The moment her palm touched the ash-gray surface, the stone answered. Not with smoke, not with warning, with fire, climbing up her wrist in a ring of white gold light, searing through 19 years of borrowed silence, and the crowd's gasp came a half-second before her own body betrayed her completely. Bones she had suppressed since infancy cracked into place. Fur she had never once allowed to surface tore through skin that had spent a lifetime pretending it belonged to a girl with nothing to hide. Sorrel Vane was not wolfless. She never had been. Someone screamed. Someone else, an elder, she thought, though she couldn't tell anymore, could barely hear past the roaring in her own ears, shouted a word she'd feared her whole life. Unregistered, unclaimed, dangerous. But none of it mattered, because across the circle, near the front where the Alpha's seat had stood empty only a breath ago, Cale Duskthorn was already on his feet. He was not looking at the fire, he was not looking at the fur, or the fangs, or the trembling girl collapsing back into her own skin as the transformation finished tearing her secret out into the open air. He was looking at her scent, the way his head had gone perfectly still, the way his jaw had locked, the way something feral and ancient moved behind his eyes the instant her true nature hit the wind. And whatever his face was doing right now, kneeling there in the ashes, Sorrel realized with dawning horror, it was not the reaction of a man discovering a stranger. Chapter 1. 3 weeks before the trial of ashes, Sorrel Vane was the best liar in Ashwood, and the best healer's apprentice the pack had produced in a generation. She could set a broken wing bone in under 2 minutes, blind, by feel alone. She could tell fever from shift sickness by scent, before the patient even complained of chills. Old Marrow, the pack's healer, had trained a dozen apprentices in 30 years and told anyone who'd listen that none of them had Sorrel's hands. Steady, precise, unshaking, even when the wolf on the table was twice her size and screaming through a broken femur. It was the unshaking part that gave her away, if anyone had thought to look closely. A wolfless girl should have trembled around that much blood, that much raw shifter pain. Sorrel never did. She simply didn't let herself. She had rules. Rules kept her alive. Never shift, not even in dreams. Never run past a jog. Never let your eyes catch torchlight wrong. Never, ever, let anyone touch your wrist near the pulse point, where the change starts first. She had followed every rule for 19 years, and in exchange, Ashwood had let her exist at its margins, pitied, mostly ignored, useful enough in the healer's tent to be tolerated. Wolfless daughters married human tradesmen in the lowland towns, if they married at all. Nobody expected anything from Sorrel Vane, and that was exactly how she'd built her life to survive. The Alpha, meanwhile, existed on a different plane of the world entirely. Cale Duskthorn had taken the seat 2 years ago after his father's death. Young for an Alpha, colder than his father had been, and precise in a way that unsettled the pack elders more than his youth did. He didn't rage, he calculated. He walked the training grounds twice a week and said almost nothing, and somehow that silence carried more weight than any of his father's roaring ever had. Sorrel had spoken to him exactly once, 4 months ago, when a training accident brought a bleeding beta into her tent, and the alpha had followed, uninvited, to watch her work. He hadn't said a word the entire time. He'd simply stood in the corner with his arms crossed, watching her hands move, watching her stitch torn muscle back into place, with a competence that made the beta stop groaning out of sheer surprise. When she'd finished, Cale had looked at her, really looked, the way no one in Ashwood ever bothered to, and said only, "You're wasted here." Then he'd left, and she'd told herself it meant nothing, because it couldn't mean anything. Wolfless girls were not wasted. Wolfless girls were background. She'd almost believed herself. Then, 3 weeks later, the Pack Council announced the trial of Ashes, mandatory, all unregistered adults, no exceptions, ordered by the Alpha's own seal, and Sorrel understood, with the particular clarity of someone watching a cliff finally arrive after years of walking toward it in the dark, that 19 years of careful rules were about to run out of road. She went to the ceremony anyway. There had never really been a version of this where she didn't. Chapter 2. The fire on Sorrel's wrist was still cooling when the shouting started in earnest. Unregistered, unclaimed, dangerous. The words kept circling the crowd like carrion birds, elders arguing over her collapsed body about protocol, about precedent, about what Ashwood law demanded be done with a wolf who had hidden in plain sight for 19 years. Someone mentioned exile. Someone else, older and harder voiced, mentioned worse. Sorrel couldn't stand yet. Her legs still remembered fur, not feet. She knelt in the ash circle in a stranger's body that happened to be her own, and she understood, distantly, that the pack was deciding her fate 3 feet away, as though she were furniture. Then, Cale Duskthorn crossed the circle. He didn't ask permission. He didn't consult the elders mid-argument. He simply walked through the middle of them, and the shouting broke apart around him the way water breaks around stone. "She's under my protection," he said. Not loud. He didn't need loud. The trial warden turned, startled. "Alpha, she's unregistered. The law requires registration within the pack's authority." Cale's eyes hadn't left Sorrel once. "She's about to have that. As of tonight, she answers to me, not the council." It wasn't kindness. Sorrel understood that even through the ringing in her ears, this wasn't rescue, it was claim, a legal wall thrown up faster than the elders could object, and now she belonged to a category of Ashwood law that had nothing to do with what she wanted. She tried anyway. You need somewhere the council can't touch you tonight," he said, low, only for her. "Argue with me tomorrow. Tonight, you don't have a choice." He was right, and that was the worst part. She had no house that would take in an unregistered wolf who'd deceived the pack for 19 years. No standing to refuse an alpha's protection in front of witnesses who were already reconsidering exile in favor of something crueler. She was trapped by the very fire that had exposed her, and the only door left standing had his name on it. Beside him, his beta, a broad-shouldered man named Orrin Ashcombe who Sorrel vaguely recognized from the training grounds, leaned in with open disbelief written across his face. "You're inviting an unregistered shifter into the pack house? Tonight? Alpha, the council will do what I tell them," Cale said, and something flickered behind his eyes when he said it. Not quite temper, not quite amusement, something Sorrel couldn't name yet. It was the first crack she'd seen in the calculated stillness the whole pack feared. He caught her watching it happen and, for half a second, looked almost startled to have been seen. Then it was gone, and the alpha was unreadable again. "Get her inside," he told Orrin. "Now, before the elders find their nerve." Sorrel let herself be helped up, ash still clinging to her palms. 19 years of careful invisibility burned away in front of the entire pack, and she still didn't understand why the most powerful man in Ashwood had just spent his own authority protecting a girl he had no reason to want. Chapter there. The pack house was nothing like Sorrel had imagined from the healer's tent. where rumors about the Alpha's private quarters ranged from ascetic to obscene. It was quiet, orderly. A house built for a man who trusted almost no one enough to fill it with company. She was given a room on the east wing, plain, warm, with a lock on the inside that Oren pointedly showed her worked. "For you," he said, not quite meeting her eyes. "Not against you. Alpha's orders." She didn't believe that entirely. She wasn't sure Oren believed it either. For 3 days she watched Kale the way she'd once watched shift fever patients, cataloging symptoms, waiting for the moment the mask slipped, and told her what she was actually dealing with. It was easy to justify. A man who'd thrown away political capital to protect an unregistered stranger wasn't acting from simple duty, and Sorrel had spent her whole life reading the difference between a lie and a truth someone hadn't said out loud yet. She needed to know which one he was. What she found didn't fit the pack's stories about him. He ate dinner alone every night at the same hour, in the same chair, facing the door. A habit, she suspected, from a father who hadn't always come home safe. He read late, longer than any Alpha needed to, books on pack law stacked beside older ones on healing, herb lore, the kind of texts her own mentor kept. On the second night, she found a chipped mug in the kitchen, clearly his, clearly favorite, clearly never once replaced despite an Alpha's easy access to better. Small things, human things, nothing the pack gossip had prepared her for. On the third evening, she caught him watching her back, not the polite, distant attention of a host, but something more careful, more constant, gone, the instant she turned toward it. She said nothing. She filed it away instead, the way she filed away every fact that didn't fit. It was Oren who finally said what she'd been circling for days, catching her alone in the hallway outside the study. "He doesn't do this," he said quietly. "Doesn't bring people in. Doesn't sit up half the night listening at doors like he thinks the house might catch fire." He studied her with an expression somewhere between suspicion and genuine bewilderment. "Whatever you did to him at that trial, Vane, you should know. He's not acting like our Alpha. He's acting like a man who already knows something the rest of us don't." "I didn't do anything to him," Sorrel said. "I didn't even know him." "Maybe not," Oren said, "but I don't think that's true the other way around." He left her with that, and Sorrel stood alone in the hallway a long time afterward, replaying every unreadable flicker she'd caught behind Kale's eyes since the trial, and asking herself, for the first time, whether the thing she'd been investigating wasn't a threat at all. What, exactly, was Kale Duskthorn hiding, and why did it feel less like a danger to uncover and more like a door she wasn't ready to open? Chapter 4. She found him in the study on the fourth night, later than she meant to, unable to sleep after Oren's words had lodged themselves somewhere she couldn't dig them out. Kale looked up from his book like he'd been expecting her. "You should be resting," he said. "You should be explaining." Sorrel stayed in the doorway, arms crossed, aware she was breaking every rule she'd built her survival on. Never draw attention, never ask, never risk being seen too closely, and doing it anyway, because the rules had already burned in the ash circle. "Your beta thinks you knew something about me before the trial. I'd like to know if he's right." Something shifted behind Kale's eyes. Not surprise exactly. More like the particular stillness of a man deciding how much truth a room could hold. He set the book down. "Sit," he said, and when she didn't move, added, "Quieter. Please." She sat. Barely. "I didn't know you were a wolf," he said. "I want to be clear about that first, because I know what it sounds like otherwise." He paused, and for the first time since she'd met him, he looked less like an Alpha and more like a man choosing his next words, the way she chose sutures, carefully, aware one wrong pull could tear everything open. "But I knew you weren't what the pack thought you were. I've known for months." "How?" "The way you moved in that healer's tent, the way you read a room before you spoke in it. Wolfless girls don't carry themselves like that, like they're always half a second from having to defend something." His jaw tightened. "I've spent my whole life around people who hide what they are. My father taught me to see it before I could walk properly. I saw it in you the first week you started apprenticing under Marrow." And you said nothing. What was I supposed to say? I think you're lying to the entire pack. Please continue. A ghost of something almost like humor crossed his face, gone as fast as it came. You'd built something that was keeping you alive. I wasn't going to be the reason it collapsed before you were ready. It stopped her breath a little, the plainness of it, the fact that he'd known, and watched, and said nothing, not out of indifference but out of something that looked disturbingly like care. She hadn't expected that. She'd prepared herself for calculation, for a man protecting an asset. She hadn't prepared for a man who'd simply been waiting. That's not an answer to why you claimed me tonight, she said, because she needed somewhere safer to stand than the last thought. No, he agreed. It isn't. He didn't offer more, but his eyes held hers a beat too long before he looked away. Long enough that Sorrel understood, with sudden unease, that this wasn't only about a secret he'd chosen not to expose. There was something else underneath it, something he wasn't ready to say yet either. And somewhere down the hall, unnoticed by either of them, a shadow that didn't belong to the house moved past the study window and was gone. Chapter 5. The shadow at the window became a pattern within a week. Sorrel noticed it first. She'd spent 19 years noticing things before anyone else did. It was how she'd survived. A scent that didn't belong on the East Wing grounds, faint and gone before she could name it. Twice at dusk, once well past midnight when she'd woken from a dream about ash and firelight. She said nothing at first. Old habits didn't die just because the rules that built them had burned. But the third night, she found claw marks on the outer sill of Cale's study window, 4 parallel gouges too deliberate to be accidental, and the habit of silence finally lost to something stronger. She brought it to him directly, laying it out the way she'd lay out a diagnosis. Clean, ordered, no room for him to dismiss it as nerves. Someone's been watching this house. Watching you. This isn't the first time, is it? Cale's expression didn't change, but something in the room did. A stillness that felt less like calm now, and more like a man bracing. No, he admitted. It isn't. Then why hasn't Oren doubled the watch? Because I don't know who I can trust with what I suspect yet. He said it quietly, and for the first time she heard exhaustion under the control. The weight of a man who'd been carrying a threat alone since before she'd ever collapsed in that ash circle. My father's death wasn't an accident, Sorrel. I've believed that for 2 years. I've never been able to prove it, because whoever did it is close enough to the pack to erase every trail before I find it. It landed harder than she expected. Not just the confession, but the fact that he'd handed it to her at all, unprompted, the way Rule 3 of every wound she'd ever stitched taught her that trust wasn't spoken until it was already earned in smaller ways first. He'd been leaving those smaller ways for weeks. The chair angled toward the door each night. The way he'd started keeping a second chair pulled out in the study, like he expected her before she arrived. She didn't let herself dwell on what that meant. Not yet. I can help, she said instead. I know healing. I know poison signatures better than most of your guards, and if someone's circling close enough to leave scent on your windowsill, I can track what they're circling for. That's not why I told you. I know, she said, quieter than she meant to. That's exactly why I'm offering. Something passed between them then, brief, unspoken, dangerously close to the thing neither of them had named yet. He reached out, almost without meaning to, fingers grazing the inside of her wrist where the shift-fire scar still marked her skin. And Sorrel felt it, absurdly, all the way to her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with fever. Oren's voice cut through the hallway outside, sharp and urgent, calling the Alpha's name, and Cale pulled back fast, expression sealing shut again, leaving Sorrel with her pulse still racing, and the unbearable sense that she'd been half a second from something neither of them would have been able to take back. Chapter 6. The evidence Oren brought that night should have felt like a victory. Instead, it broke everything open. A ledger, smuggled out of the council archive by a beta loyal to Cale's father. Old, water-stained, but legible enough. Payments, routed through 3 false names, all traced back to a single signature that made Oren's face go pale in the study's lamplight. Halric Vane, Sorrel's uncle. She read it twice before her mind accepted what her eyes had already understood. Her uncle, who'd raised her mother's shame like a banner for 19 years, who'd been the loudest voice in the Ash Circle demanding the harshest reading of pack law once her secret burned into the open, her uncle had been paying informants inside the pack house for 2 years, since before Kale's father died. He's the one who's been watching this house, Kale said, quiet, careful, watching her absorb it. I think he's the one who killed my father. And you think I knew? It wasn't a question. She could hear it in the careful distance he'd put back into his voice, the same distance he'd used the first night they'd spoken, before any of this. That's why you claimed me, not protection, proximity. You wanted to watch me. That's not, isn't it? Her voice cracked on the word, and she hated that it did. Hated that 19 years of controlling every visible piece of herself had apparently ended at exactly the moment it mattered most. I hid what I was to survive, and the one person who saw through it decided the safest use of that was to keep me close and see what I'd give away. Sorrel, he said her name like it cost him something. I didn't know about your uncle until an hour ago. I swear that to you. But you suspected someone close to me before that, didn't you? She watched his silence answer for him, and something in her chest went cold and final. You should have told me the moment you brought me into this house, instead of letting me fall for... She stopped herself. Too late. The words were already halfway to the truth she hadn't meant to say aloud. Kale's jaw tightened, and for one raw second, she saw exactly how much restraint it took him not to close the distance between them, not to argue, not to grab her wrist the way instinct clearly wanted. He didn't. He stood very still instead, hands loose at his sides, letting her have the space to walk away from him, even though every line of his body looked like it was costing him everything. I won't stop you if you want to leave, he said. I won't send guards after you. I won't make this harder than it already is. His voice roughened, just slightly, the only crack he allowed himself. But I need you to know, none of what happened between us this week was strategy. Whatever else is true, that wasn't. Sorrel didn't answer. She turned and walked out of the study, past Oren's stricken face in the hallway, out into the cold night air, where her uncle's betrayal and Kale's silence tangled together into something she couldn't yet separate. She was right to walk away. She told herself that with every step, she just couldn't make herself believe it made anything better. Chapter 7. Sorrel spent 2 days in the healer's tent, back among bandages and fever charts, telling herself the work would quiet her mind the way it always had. It didn't. Marrow noticed and said nothing, which was worse than if he'd asked. On the second night, Halric came to find her. He didn't look like a man who'd been exposed. He looked calm, almost fond, the way he always had when he was about to say something designed to cut. I heard you left the Alpha's house, he said, settling into the tent's single spare chair uninvited. Smart girl. I always said you had sense, under all that hiding. I know what you did. She kept her voice level, the way she'd once kept her hands steady over a wolf twice her size. I saw the ledger. Something in his face flickered. Not fear. Calculation. Whatever you think you saw, it doesn't change what you are, Sorrel. Unregistered. Unclaimed. The Council hasn't forgotten that, even if Duskthorn has been distracted. He leaned forward. But I can make that go away. I can vouch for you, quiet the Council, if you tell me one thing. What has he learned? What does he suspect? And there it was. Not concern. Not family. A transaction. Same as it had always been. Except now she could finally see the shape of it clearly. Every year of quiet cruelty, every reminder of her shame, engineered to keep her small enough, grateful enough, to be useful exactly like this when the moment came. You've been using me my whole life, she said slowly, the truth arriving even as she spoke it. Not just now, since I was a child, keeping me ashamed so I'd never look too closely at you. Halric's expression hardened. I kept you safe. Do you understand what happens to unregistered wolves who draw attention? I built you a life where no one asked questions. You built me a cage and called it mercy. She stood, done with the chair, done with him. Get out. He left, but not before his eyes went cold in a way that told her the conversation wasn't finished, that whatever he needed from Cale's suspicions, he'd find another way to get it now. She didn't sleep that night. Instead, she went back through every memory of the past 2 years with new eyes. Every strange absence Halric had offered no explanation for. Every time he'd conveniently known things he shouldn't. By dawn, the picture was undeniable, and so was what it meant. Her uncle wasn't circling the pack house out of ambition alone. He was afraid of what Cale's father had discovered before he died, and afraid Cale was close to discovering it too. She found Oren at the training grounds instead of returning to the pack house. Your alpha needs to know Halric came to me directly, she said. He's accelerating. Whatever he's planning, he's not waiting anymore. Oren studied her for a long moment. You could tell him yourself. I know. He hasn't slept since you left Vane. Hasn't eaten a full meal. Won't say your name, which for him is basically a confession. Oren's voice softened, just slightly. He let you go because he thought that's what you needed. That doesn't mean it's what either of you wants. Sorrel said nothing, but the words settled somewhere she couldn't argue them away from, and somewhere beyond the training grounds, unseen, Halric Vane was already setting the final piece of his plan into motion, with or without her help. Chapter 8. The council chamber was full by the time Sorrel arrived, breathless, Oren half a step behind her, Halric already standing before the elders, mid-argument, demanding the Alpha's fitness be formally reviewed on grounds of harboring an unregistered threat and compromised judgment. Cale stood across from him, controlled and cold in the way she now understood cost him everything to maintain. His eyes found hers the instant she entered, and something in his shoulders eased, just slightly, before the mask reasserted itself. I have proof, Sorrel said, loud enough to cut through the chamber, striding to the center where her uncle stood. Not accusations, proof. She laid it out plainly. The ledger Oren had found, the false names, the timeline that placed Halric's payments beginning months before the old Alpha's death and continuing straight through her own exposure at the trial. She watched color drain from her uncle's face as elder after elder turned to look at him instead of her, the shame that had defined her whole life redirecting, finally, to where it belonged. You orchestrated my exposure, she said, understanding arriving even as the words left her. You knew the trial of ashes would force my shift. You wanted the chaos, wanted the council distracted, wanted Cale isolated and desperate enough to make mistakes you could exploit. You have no proof of intent, Halric snapped, but his voice had lost its certainty. I have his own ledger, in his own hand, and a healer's memory for detail, Sorrel said. That's enough. Cale stepped forward then, and when he spoke, his voice carried the full weight of 2 years of grief finally given somewhere to land. You killed my father, he said, quiet and absolute. And you spent 2 years letting me believe I'd failed to protect him, while you circled his son the same way you circled his healer's apprentice, looking for the next weakness to exploit. The elder's verdict, once it came, was swift. Halric's authority stripped, his claims against Sorrel's registration voided in the same breath, the chamber's suspicion turning fully and finally onto the man who'd built his standing on manufactured shame. When the guards led Halric out, Cale crossed the chamber floor without waiting for the formalities to finish, stopping close enough that Sorrel had to tilt her head to hold his eyes. I should have told you everything from the start, he said, low, only for her. Not because it would have changed what he did. Because you deserve to make your choices with the full truth, not pieces of it. I let my own caution cost us both something I don't intend to lose again. And if I choose to walk away anyway, she asked, though her pulse was already answering for her. Then I let you go. Again, if I have to. His voice roughened. But I'm asking you not to. Not because I claimed you at that trial, not because of anything the council decided, because these past weeks are the first time in 2 years I haven't felt entirely alone in this house, and I don't want to go back to before. Sorrel felt something in her chest, cautious, fragile, no longer contained by 19 years of careful walls, finally choose to answer. "Then I'm choosing to stay," she said. "Not because you claimed me, because I want to." Kale's hand found hers, steady, where hers still trembled slightly, and for the first time since the fire had burned through her wrist, Sorrel let herself believe the danger was finally, truly over. Chapter 9. The formal claiming ceremony was held 3 weeks later, in the same circle where the trial of ashes had once burned her secret into the open air. A choice Kale made deliberately, and one Sorrel understood the moment she saw the torches lit around the ash stone at dusk. "This is where they saw you exposed," he said, standing beside her as the pack gathered, rows deep, the same faces that had once shouted unregistered, now waiting in a very different kind of silence. "I want this to be where they see you claimed, not as something forced out of hiding, as something chosen." The elders who presided were the same council that had nearly exiled her weeks before, and Sorrel felt the old flicker of dread rise as they called her forward. Until Kale's hand found the small of her back, steady, grounding, and the dread quieted into something else entirely. Oren spoke first, as Beta, formally vouching for her role in exposing Halrick's conspiracy, his voice carrying easily across the circle. "She saved this pack twice over," he said. "Once with proof, once with the sense to walk back through that door when it would have been easier not to." Then Kale spoke, and the chamber went utterly still. 19 years ago, this pack decided who Sorrel Vane was before she ever had the chance to show them, he said. "I won't undo that harm by pretending it didn't happen, but I will not let it define what happens next." He turned to her fully, and for the first time in front of the entire pack, let every careful wall drop. "I claim Sorrel Vane, not because the trial forced her secret into the light, and not because law required it. Because she is the finest healer this pack has had in a generation, because she faced down the man who orchestrated her own worst day and did not flinch, and because in every quiet hour since, she has been the one thing steady in a house that forgot what steady felt like." Sorrel felt her throat tighten. 19 years of careful invisibility, finally, fully unraveling in front of the only crowd that had ever mattered. "Is this real?" she asked him quietly, beneath the pack's watching eyes, the last echo of old doubt, the habit of disbelief, too deeply worn to disappear in a single night. Kale didn't answer with words. He lifted her hand, pressed his lips to the faint silver scar circling her wrist, where the trial's fire had marked her. The same place his fingers had grazed weeks ago in the study, the moment neither of them had let themselves name, and the warmth that spread through her at the touch was answer enough. The pack's roar of acknowledgement rose around them, torchlight catching gold in Kale's eyes as he pulled her close, and for the first time since the fire had torn her secret into the open, Sorrel Vane stood in the center of Ashwood, not hidden, not ashamed, not waiting to be found out, but simply, finally, home. Epilogue. 2 years later, the ash circle looked almost gentle in the late afternoon light. The scorch marks softened by seasons of rain, wildflowers pushing up stubborn and unbothered at its edges. Sorrel liked to walk past it on her way to the healer's tent each morning, not to remember the fear of that night, but because it no longer had any power to summon it. "You always slow down here," Kale said, falling into step beside her, 2 mugs of tea in hand, hers exactly how she liked it, which he'd learned without her ever having to say. "Old habit," she admitted, "checking it's really over." "It's over." He handed her the mug. "You checked yesterday too." "I'll keep checking." She smiled at him over the rim. Some habits are allowed to stay. Inside the healer's tent, 3 new apprentices were waiting, Sorrel's own now, trained under her the way Marrow had once trained her, though Marrow still visited twice a week to complain, fondly, that none of them had her hands. She'd built a wing onto the old tent last spring, funded quietly by an alpha who insisted the pack's healing house deserved better than it had, and never once let her thank him for it properly. That evening, Kale found her at the study window, the same one that had once carried claw marks and shadows in the dark, replaced now, permanently, with glass thick enough that nothing outside could trouble what happened inside. "Long day?" he asked, settling into the second chair across from her, the one he'd started keeping out for her before either of them had admitted what it meant. "Good day," she corrected. "A difference I still notice." He reached for her hand, thumb brushing lightly over the faint silver scar at her wrist. Smaller now, softened like the ash circle, though never quite gone. It didn't feel like a wound anymore. It felt like a beginning she carried with her. "Do you ever think about that night?" she asked. "The fire?" "Every day," he said simply. "It's the night I stopped watching you from a distance and started choosing to stand close instead." Outside, the last torchlight of the training grounds caught the same gold in his eyes it had the night the whole pack had watched him claim her. Except now there were no witnesses, no counsel, no fire forcing anything into the open. Just the quiet certainty of a girl who no longer had anything left to hide, and a man who had never once wanted her to.